On to another major movement that was there in the 1940s, which is Neo-Romanticism. Neo-Romanticism and Surrealism went hand in hand. It can be said that Neo-Romanticism has its roots in the Surrealism of the 1940s. Contemporary with and originating from Surrealism was another movement in English poetry known as Neo-Romanticism. Neo means new and Romanticism. The Surrealist poets Dylan Thomas and George Barker were the major proponents of Neo-Romanticism too. The Neo-Romantics laid emphasis on the romantic qualities of emotion and imagination than on neoclassical ones like reason and intellect favored by the 30s poets. So, in the earlier lecture, we said that the 30s poets favored reason and intellect rather than emotion and feeling. So, reason and intellect are neoclassical tendencies. To give importance to reason and intellect is a neoclassical tendency, whereas to give importance to emotion and imagination is a romantic tendency. Since it gave emphasis to emotion and imagination, which were rather subjective, the poetry of the period came to be known as Neo-Romanticism, a revival of the old romantic principles of the early 19th century. The later works of Dylan Thomas reveals responsiveness to natural beauty as can be seen in the romantic poets of the early 19th century. So, romantic poets of the early 19th century. In the 1899, the preface to the lyrical ballads was published in 1898, 1899 and 1900s, and by then 1902 the subsequent editions were published. So, the Romantics gave importance to nature. Similarly, Neo-Romantics too gave importance to natural beauty. And in the later poems of Dylan Thomas, we can see an increasing responsiveness to natural beauty. He began to write about natural beauty. He began to write about the parables of sunlight, again, which was a vivid imagery of sunlight gleaming through the leaves of a tree. So, again, that appears in the poem in October, one of his famous poems. So, in his later poems, Dylan Thomas reveals a more responsiveness to natural beauty as can be seen in the romantic poets of the early 19th century. So, the romantic poets of the early 19th century too focused on natural beauty. Similarly, the Neo-Romantics gave focus to natural beauty and lush and beautiful imagery. Now, George Barker's poetry abounds in Keatsian sensuousness and lushness of imagery. So, there is a freshness of imagery in George Barker's later poetry. And his later poetry also abounds in or contains Keatsian sensuousness. What do you mean by Keatsian sensuousness? In the poems of John Keats, you can see that he addresses all the five senses. So you have images pertaining to visuals, you have images pertaining to sounds, to taste, to smell, to touch. So all these images are there in Keats's poetry. So Keats's poetry is highly sensuous. Similarly, George Baker's poetry too was highly sensuous like the Keatsian poetry, and it was noted for its lushness or freshness of imagery. The lack of social concern and the treatment of private world instead of social reality made these neo-romantic poets akin to the decadence of the 1890s. And thematically, the poets of the 1940s were similar to the decadence of the 1890s. So the decadents were a group of poets and writers who were there scattered all over the Western Europe. They gave importance to arts for art's sake or aestheticism. So they were against logical constructions because they believed that everything is illogical and absurd. So there is no place for logical constructions in poetry. And similarly, decadents wrote giving much importance to form. Similarly, the neo-romantics too gave more importance to form as opposed to content, which was focused by the poets of the 1930s. Another thing that you need to remember in this context is that in an earlier slide we discussed that Roy Campbell, who was the author of Talking Bronco, attacked the 30s group of poets as Max Pandey group, taking a dig at their homosexuality as well as attacking them for their usage of political themes. He attacked them for using poetry to carry political themes. So Roy Campbell was in favor of neo-romantics. He wanted poetry to be addressing the emotions as well as the imagination of the reader rather than the intellect. So he wanted poetry to be more emotional and pertaining to imagination rather than the intellect. So Roy Campbell stood with the neo-romantics and attacked the poets of the 1930s. That's also another point that you need to take note when you remember neo-romanticism. So all these movements are interconnected. റോയ് ക്യാമ്പൽ ന്യൂ റൊമാൻറ്റിക്സിൻ്റെ കൂടെ നിന്ന് ന്യൂ റൊമാൻറ്റിക്സിനെ ഫേവർ ചെയ്തിട്ടാണ് 30s പോയറ്റ്സിന് എഗൻസ്റ്റ് ആയിട്ട് ഒരു സ്റ്റേറ്റ്മെൻറ്റ് മേക്ക് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. സോ ഈ കാര്യം കൂടെ ഒന്ന് ഓർത്ത് വയ്ക്കുക. Now moving on to the next slide, which shows the characteristics of neo-romantic poetry or the characteristic features that were followed by a neo-romantic poet. So these words come from G.S. Fraser. G.S. Fraser is a famous critic at that time, and he said that the neo-romantic movements accepted the idea that now some of these lines are paraphrased. It's not as it is not a quote by G.S. Fraser. That's why I haven't written it within quotes. I have paraphrased his sentence. So take care when you write it down. So the neo-romantic movement accepted the idea that poets should use images that arose spontaneously in his mind without trying to understand them. So the neo-romantics accepted the idea that the poets should use images that arose spontaneously in his mind. So the poet should write down images that appear spontaneously in his mind without trying to understand them. So here they are not even favoring the romantics. In that, romantics said that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. There, recollected in tranquility is the word, because you need to recollect it and then write it. But the neo-romantics focused more on spontaneity in the poetic creation as a spontaneous process, and that you need to write it down without trying to understand it. Whenever a poetic thought comes to your mind, you need to write it down without trying to understand it. Then he, again referring to the neo-romantic poet, the neo-romantic poet should let one image suggest another. So in a neo-romantic poetry, one image comes after the other in a series of successions. So a succession of images are a neo-romantic poetry. From one image it moves to the next. So the poet should let one image suggest the other without trying to work out the pattern of the poem logically. പോയത്തിൻ്റെ പാറ്റേൺ ലോജിക്കലി എങ്ങനെയാണെന്ന് വർക്കൗട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്നതിന് പകരം ഒരു ഇമേജ് അടുത്ത ഇമേജിനെ കാണിക്കുന്നു, അതിൻ്റെ അടുത്ത ഇമേജിലോട്ട് പോകുന്നു. ലൈക്ക് ദാറ്റ് ഇറ്റ് ഷുഡ് ഗോ. Poets uses image that arose spontaneously in his mind without trying to understand them, and the poet should let one image suggest the other without trying to work out pattern of the poem logically. Poem should be written like this, with a beginning, middle and an end, or it should have a rhythmic construction, or that the first stanza should follow mellifluously the second stanza and then the third stanza. It was not written like that. But one image that is used in the first stanza should follow the subsequent images, and there should be a coherence or connection between these images that the poet used. I think that's clear. Now the neo-romantic poet should be as surrealists were not selective. Now, what makes neo-romantic poetry different from surrealism? Because so far they talked about spontaneously writing, which was there in the automated writing of the surrealist. Then J.S. Fraser also mentioned that one image should suggest the other. So, as can be seen in the poem by David Gascoigne, one image suggested the other in that poem too. So, what makes it different from surrealism is that surrealists were not selective in writing their themes, but neo-romantics were selective in writing down their themes. So, the neo-romantic poet should be as surrealists were not selective. So, he should be as surrealists were not, the surrealists were not selective, but neo-romantics were selective. So, he should be as surrealists were not suggestive. He should reject images that seem to be trivial or jarring. വളരെ സിമ്പിൾ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ട്രിവിയൽ ആയിട്ട് തോന്നുന്ന ഇമേജസ് ഒന്നും ഉപയോഗിക്കാൻ പാടില്ല. വളരെ jarring, macabre ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഇമേജസ് ലൈക്ക് വി സീ ഇൻ ദ പോയം ബൈ ഡേവിഡ് കാസ്കോയിൻ. സച്ച് ഇമേജസ് ഷുഡ് ഓൾസോ ബി ഡൺ away with. So, he should reject the images that seem to be trivial or jarring, accepting only those images which seem to have a certain massiveness and emotional coherence with the other images in the poem. So, the images that the poet use must be in coherence or must be in cohesion with the other images used in the poem. One after the other, when the images come, it should have some kind of a coherence or some kind of a cohesion with other images of the poem, and it should have a massiveness. It should not be something trivial. It should be suggestive. It should be massive in its proportions. The neo-romantic poet should shape his poem as a work of art with regard to rhyme and meter and amenities of diction, and in fact on the traditional formal demands made on the English poet. Now, there is a slight change here. It was not amnesties, it was amenities. So, the neo-romantic poet should shape his poem as a work of art. So, ultimately, the neo-romantic poet must consider his poem as a work of art in regard to rhythm and meter. So, in David Gascoigne's poem, you saw that there was no rhythm or meter, there was not even capitalization in the poem, there was no stanzaic form. So, it should not be like that. Like the surrealist or surrealist poetry, neo-romantic poetry should not be like the surrealist poetry, in that you should consider the poem as a work of art with regard to rhyme and meter, which means that there should be a set rhyme or meter in the poems, and amenities of diction. And even in the choice of words, you need to keep in mind that you are writing a poem and then choose words. And in fact, the traditional formal demands made by the English, and you need to follow all the traditional and formal demands that an English reader might expect from an English poet. So, an English reader might expect a certain traditional form from the English poet. A normal reader of a poetry would expect a kind of form from an English poet, and that should be followed. ഒരു പോയം എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ ഒരു രീതിയിലായിരിക്കണം എന്ന് നമുക്കുണ്ട്. ആ രീതിയിൽ തന്നെ ആയിരിക്കണം എഴുതേണ്ടത്. Even if the material of the poem all came from subconscious mind at aesthetic or formal, there should be a conscious control. Even if the material came from the subconscious mind, there should be a comma here. Even if the material of the poem, everything, all means all the, even if all the material of the poem came from the subconscious mind, at an aesthetic level, it should be formal. That is, in the formal level, it should be, it should come under the consensus of, or it should come under the censure of conscious mind. There should be a conscious control over the form. ഏത് തീം വേണോ യൂസ് ചെയ്യാം, പക്ഷേ there should be a conscious control over the form. So, these are the major characteristic features that a neo-romantic poet must follow according to G.S. Fraser. So, major things are that the poetry should arise from spontaneity, and he must try to write it down without trying to understand it. Then one image should suggest the other. You will come to see it in detail, or you will be able to witness it in detail when we discuss the poem A Poem in October, written by Dylan Thomas, where you can see a series or succession of images coming one after the other, and it suggests, one image suggests the other, which is a characteristic trait of neo-romantic poetry. Then neo-romantic poetry does not use jarring images in their poem. Stark images won't come like in David Gascoigne's poem that we discussed earlier. Then it should, even the images should have an emotional coherence with other images of the poem. Each and every image that we showcase in the poem should have an emotional coherence. It should have an emotional connect with other images of the poem. Then he should shape his poem as a work of art with regard to meter. So in the form also, the poet must keep in mind that this is a poem, it is a work of art. So we must keep in mind the rhythm and meter, and we must follow all the amenities of diction, the usage and the choice of words. Right choice of words should be there. Then it should be similar to the demands made by an English poet. So in fact, on the traditional forms, formal demands made on the English poet. So the English readers always place a demand on the English poet that a poem should be written in a particular way. One must not deviate from the traditional norms of writing poetry when you are experimenting with form. When you are over experimenting with form, don't forget that you are writing poetry and then over experiment it with forms and then make the poems more or less obscure. It should not be like that. So അങ്ങനെ ഒരുപാട് ഫോമിൽ എക്സ്പെരിമെൻ്റ് ചെയ്ത് ഒന്നും മനസ്സിലാവാത്ത ഒബ്സ്ക്യൂരിറ്റിയിലോട്ട് കൊണ്ടുപോകാൻ പാടില്ല. So even if the poem is written from the subconscious mind, the form must be under the censure of conscious mind. പോയം എഴുതുന്ന സബ് കോൺഷ്യസ് മൈൻഡിൽ നിന്നായിരിക്കാം, തീം എടുക്കുന്നത് സബ് കോൺഷ്യസ് മൈൻഡിൽ നിന്നായിരിക്കാം, പക്ഷേ എസ്തെറ്റിക്കലി ഫോർമലി സ്പീക്കിംഗ് ഇറ്റ് ഷുഡ് ബി ദ ഫോം ഷുഡ് ബി അണ്ടർ ദ സെൻഷർ ഓഫ് കോൺഷ്യസ് മൈൻഡ്. കോൺഷ്യസ് മൈൻഡിൽ നമ്മൾ ഫോം ഇങ്ങനെ ആയിരിക്കണം എന്ന രീതിയിൽ തന്നെ ആയിരിക്കണം ഫോർമലി അത് റിട്ടേൺ ചെയ്യുന്നത്, അത് എഴുതുന്നത്. സോ എല്ലാ ഫോർമൽ ആസ്പെക്ട്സും ഒരു കോൺഷ്യസ് മൈൻഡിൻ്റെ സെൻഷറിലൂടെ, അതായത് ബോധ മനസ്സിൻ്റെ സെൻഷറിലൂടെ മാത്രമേ ഉപബോധ മനസ്സിലെ എഴുത്തുകളാവാം, പക്ഷേ ബോധ മനസ്സിൻ്റെ സെൻഷറിലൂടെ മാത്രമേ അത് പോകാൻ പാടുള്ളൂ. അതായത് നമുക്ക് ബോധം ഉണ്ടായിരിക്കണം നമ്മൾ എഴുതുന്നത് പോയമാണെന്ന്, ആ രീതിയിൽ മാത്രമേ നമ്മൾ എഴുതാൻ പാടുള്ളൂ എന്നാണ് G.S. ഫ്രേസർ പറഞ്ഞത്. Now moving on to the major poem written by Dylan Thomas, which is Poem in October. It is a poem which was written during his 13th birthday, that is 30th birthday, 30ാമത്തെ പിറന്നാളിന് എഴുതിയ പോയമാണ്. He used to write poems like that, birthday poems. He used to write poems for each birthday, and in this particular poem there is a succession of images, and from it you can sense that this is a neo-romantic poem. We'll move on to Poem in October. It is in this poem, the poetry arises from his visit to Swansea, where he lived, and he reflects upon his childhood and his close proximity with nature, where he lived one with nature. So again, nature and natural imagery was a key feature of neo-romantic poetry. Now let's begin the poem.
The Bluetooth device is ready to pair.
So I'm sorry, there was an elemental disturbance in between. I forgot to pause this, so you can listen to the poem now.